The fact of the matter is China has staked a lot on its naval capabilities. That is the way in which it preserves some measure of influence in the Southeast Asia region. And certainly it sees that region as of particular strategic interest because the US is also looking at it.
Our next guest is Rebecca Liao. She is the co-founder and CEO of Saga, a very interesting company involved in the Web3 gaming space. We'll be talking about that space, the development of gaming and the future of gaming and technology, but also given that Rebecca has also worked on the presidential campaigns of both Joe Biden and Hilary Clinton, we'll be talking about her views on foreign policy as well. So a very interesting background with a very interesting guest. Thank you for being here, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for having me, David. It's great to be with you.
You got your economics degree at Stanford and then later went to Harvard Law School, and now you're involved in the Web3 space. Before then, you worked in several different spaces, startups, tech, politics, as we'll talk about. Which is most challenging for you? Your career journey has taken many twists and turns. Is it more challenging to work in the tech startup space or in politics, do you think?
Well, that is a tough comparison. But I would still say that it's going to be tech and it's going to be Web3 in particular. So David, thank you for doing that short intro there. It's very generous. So I would say in politics, I mean, obviously politics has become such a blood sport. I think that anyone who signs up to be a political candidate knows that they're going to go through a media storm and intense scrutiny for the better part of a year, if not more. So it's an incredibly tough gig. But having said that, you do have tried and true ways of doing things. You have a massive team, and there is a structure to the whole enterprise that makes it really a collective exercise. And I do think in some ways that does make it easier. Tech, on the other hand, because of my background in early stage startups and bringing to growth and scaling, including one unicorn, and now with Saga, also a unicorn, you really are alone. You do this alone, and you have a team of people around you who are magnificent. You hopefully have some great investors and advisors, definitely great partners and customers and users. But in the end, you are alone in bringing this to market, and that is probably what makes it the most difficult for any entrepreneur on their journey. But I've been very blessed so far to have some great people around me.
So when you advised then presidential candidate Joe Biden in 2020 on foreign policy regarding China, technology, and Asia in particular, overall, what was the attitude back then towards China? Was it one of hostility, reluctance to work with, or was it friendliness? Has it shifted then? I'll let you comment on that first.
Well, it's been a very interesting evolution because I would say that one of the few general policy bents that the Biden campaign and now administration has agreed with the Trump administration on is that we do need to be tougher on China. We do need a change in policy. So I have been in the China political scene for a very long time, have been observing both their political and economic policies and their impact on the greater Asia region. And we remember a time when in the 90s, China was booming for the first time and everybody was eager to do business. Then in the 2000s, I think there was this great hope that as this growth continued in China, that there would also be an opening up to the international order and greater reforms on a domestic level. And I think what both President Trump and President Biden are responding to is the fact that many of the hopes of the international community have not been realized. Now, for very different motivations, I think President Trump tends to think about foreign policy in a much more America-centric way. Whereas President Biden is committed to our alliances around the world and especially strengthening our alliances in the Asia Pacific region. But nevertheless, there is this focus on China as an area of interest. I think that the Biden administration's policy is best captured in the policy phrase that they've been using for the last 3 years, which is strategic competition. So on the one hand, we can definitely find ways in which we can work together and collaborate. And there are certainly big issues like climate change, for instance, or global financial stability, certainly health, in which we can work with one another. But acknowledging that with the rise of China, there is now a competitive dynamic, particularly in the technology sector. And with that comes concerns around national security and the need for potential industrial policy to combat this kind of competition. And so the relationship has changed over time. But one of the great things about President Biden is that he has been around for a very long time and he is incredibly experienced in foreign policy and he knows when things need to be slightly adjusted. And I think that we went through a period in which we were frankly barely on speaking terms with China. And I think we all realize that that was not necessarily productive as a way forward. And so you can see with recent visits from Secretary Yellen, for sure, but also Secretary Blinken recently, that there is an opening up now. Let's try to find more ways to work with one another while acknowledging the reality that these are two great powers and our interests are not always going to be aligned. But nevertheless, we have a responsibility to the world order to preserve stability and peace.
Well, the cornerstone of U.S.-Sino relations is the one China policy, which is a recognition that there is only one China. At least that's what Beijing wants.
Yeah.
President Biden has said, though, that if China attacks Taiwan in some fashion, that he would support Taiwan militarily. Was that a bluff on President Biden's part, do you think, or did he mean it?
Well, I can't speak for President Biden, and I certainly am not at all a part of his policy team now. He has very capable people within the administration to handle that. But as an outsider, I would say that what he has said is in line with the terms of the One China policy. The way the deal works is that we acknowledge in the United States that there is one China, and the formal seat of government for that one China is in Beijing. However, we also recognize the interests of Taiwan and the need for peace and stability in that region. And if China does, in fact, attack Taiwan, then we are obligated to respond in a military fashion. I think that is the current terms of that deal. So he's reiterating that. I think the issue is so sensitive that previous administrations, certainly previous administration officials, have been reticent to actually state the terms of the deal. And this continues to be a hot button topic. However, I do think in some ways it's a little overblown. There are ways in which we compete with China, frankly, on a day-to-day basis that have far greater impact on our relationship long term than these periodic flare-ups around potential military conflict.
It's been noted that there's been a flare-up of military activity in the South China Sea from the Chinese Navy. This is a quote from the U.S. Admiral John Aquilino, commander of the U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific region. He said it's getting more aggressive, they're getting more bold, and it's getting more dangerous. He's referring to naval activity from the Chinese. Are we seeing a pickup in naval exercises from the Chinese Navy as a sign of a show of strength, or is this normal, you think?
I think it's testing.
Okay.
I think it's testing the limits. And the fact of the matter is, China has staked a lot on its naval capabilities. That is the way in which it preserves some measure of influence in the Southeast Asia region. And certainly it sees that region as a particular strategic interest because the US is also looking at it. So I would say that for many of these maneuvers or military exercises that happen over time, whether it's in the form of naval exercises, sometimes the Air Force, the Chinese Air Force will get involved. Sometimes it's not military at all, and they are construction exercises on territory surrounding the Southeast Asia region. All of these are meant to test where the line actually is with the United States government. And I think that for the US government, the strategy so far has been really to deal with each and every one of these activities in an incremental fashion. So while there is testing, there is a response. But in terms of a blanket policy, I think that most people feel it's still too early to articulate anything that is going to have broad implications.
And when you were advising Biden's campaign, certainly you and your team have discussed the overarching strategy of being in the Pacific. What ultimately is the Americans' goal or objective of being in the Pacific? One criticism of foreign policy today is that the U.S. should not even be involved in quote unquote other people's business, which is to say, American forces or diplomats should just step back, let the Chinese deal with the neighbors in their region. Let the Israelis and the Iranians deal with their problems in their region, and we should just take an isolationist approach. So going back to my question, what ultimately is the American military doing in the Pacific?
Well, once again, I can't speak for our military operations or our leadership there. I think they're doing a fine job, but I find the isolationist argument quite curious, especially in how geopolitics and, frankly, any sort of international business is done nowadays. Everything is interconnected. And so to say that you don't have an interest in a particular region is probably completely disingenuous. But I think from a US perspective, this is not simply business as usual, that we are in all corners of the world and therefore should stay there. I don't think that's the motivation for it. I think what we have observed is that every single time there is significant conflict around the world, that we are called upon to act. And whether that is with respect to Russia and Ukraine, or with respect to Israel and Iran, or what's happening in the Gaza Strip, we are always called upon to act. And if we withdraw, the action will not come soon enough to be efficacious. And so, with respect to the Asia region, I think the US long-term interest is to make sure that our allies are protected there. We recognize that not everybody in the region is friendly to those allies. And depending on the administration that is in power, there may be some interest in making sure that the world is safe for democracy. That's certainly an admitted goal of US foreign policy. But I think at a baseline, everyone can agree that the US presence is necessary for achieving peace and stability on a long-term basis. And for many of these conflicts that flare up, left to their own devices, I think that they would spill over and become larger regional issues and perhaps be more destructive than they need to be. I think the US has proven itself to be a great stabilizing force for any region in which it stays involved and engaged.
What was the Biden campaign's team thinking about in regards to tariffs on China back in 2020, following the presidency of Donald Trump? There were tariffs implemented on foreign imports on Chinese and vice versa. Was the Biden administration interested in maintaining those tariffs, upping them, or removing them?
I think the Biden administration believes that trade is a very important lever with respect to China. And to the extent that the Chinese are not complying with international trade rules and regulations, then we would hold their feet to the fire because, frankly, the international bodies had not been doing so with respect to China. So, if tariffs were the specific policy for achieving that goal, I think that was up to the administration to determine. And I think what we've seen is that it has been de-emphasized because at the end of the day, it does have economic spillover effects of which the administration is keenly aware. There are better ways in which to address the fact that China has engaged in activities that flout the international order when it comes to trade and fair dealing in business practices.
Okay. What, in your opinion, should be the correct policy in response to dealing with Chinese competition in the tech sector?
I do think that the greatest strength that you have in any of these negotiations is to take care of your home situation first. So I think for the US, what that means is really bolstering its tech sector. And you would think sometimes that when you look at the tech sector here, that doesn't really need any additional help from the government for sure, but really from any other organization or body in the world, because it honestly leads in innovation. That may be true, but in terms of implementation, growing businesses, making sure that our intellectual property is protected, all those things do require some involvement from the government. And so I would encourage the Biden administration, they've done much of this already, to really engage with the tech sector to make sure that all of our crown jewels of technology, whether that's AI, whether that's quantum, that they are protected and fostered. And with respect to how we allow for the distribution of that intellectual property overseas, or whether we allow for foreign entities to invest in our tech companies, I do think that there needs to be some guardrails around that. The most important thing is disclosure, first and foremost, which I think the Biden administration has been a big advocate of. But when it comes to actually curtailing some activities and some cross-border business, I think here it's on the part of the US to start testing out the limits there, not just the limits in terms of what China will or will not be happy with, but what will the business community be happy with. And this is probably the most important factor in all of this. So Much of the relationship between the US and China has been predicated on the preferences of the cross-border business community. And prior to the Trump administration, let's say, it was overwhelmingly positive. You wouldn't meet a business person who did not want to, a US business person who didn't want to do business in China, and vice versa. And I think since the Trump administration, that feeling has definitely cooled off, some of it in response to the reality of regulation. But I think also that people who run businesses and watch their bottom lines and check their growth all the time, that they understand that there are some realities of competition now. And so I think more and more future administrations, certainly this current administration, will have to rely on guidance from that business community in order to determine what the rules of engagement will be.
What do you think about banning Chinese companies, both from a legal perspective and also a political perspective? Huawei was banned in the US, and now there's talk of banning TikTok, which is the fifth largest social media site in the world with over 180 million US users. Do you think this is the right policy?
Well, we have to be careful with bans in general. I think with Huawei, what was determined is that there is a real national security interest that we have to protect. Now, with respect to TikTok, there is also a national security interest, but more so, I think that people had a problem with how TikTok was permeating throughout the society and really affecting us on a cultural level. So very different use cases here. But I would say that with respect to a ban, first and foremost, the only way that it can happen is how it really happened with TikTok. It has to happen in some sort of democratic fashion. So Congress, for instance, has to be able to institute this. Having something come down by executive order, I think that's quite dangerous. The government getting involved in any sort of private enterprise on a unitary basis is pretty dangerous, pretty un-American, actually. So if you are going to institute it, it needs to have broad-based support. Having said that, what is a ban? So with Huawei, it was a ban, whereas with TikTok, it is a sale. It is a forced sale. They can stay in the United States as long as they divest the business to a US entity. Now, that's a very different kind of policy. Which one is correct? Is either correct? I do think that we need to be more aggressive about defending our industries, our businesses, our intellectual property, certainly our national security interests. But having said that, bans are quite heavy-handed. Bans, I would say, fall even above sanctions in terms of how aggressive they are. And it remains to be seen because just so early in their implementation phases, whether they are actually effective or not. But I would caution against too much of an instinct here to ban foreign businesses. It starts to send a very strange signal to our international business partners around the world, not just with respect to China. And I think for our domestic businesses as well, it starts to also fly in the face of this culture of open entrepreneurship in the States. So I would not make this a regular practice, but in particular circumstances, it may be warranted.
What do you think the Chinese, nobody knows, but if you were to take a guess and guess what the recourse of removing TikTok from the US, either let's say TikTok refuses to divest, right?
Yeah,
Then they would have to remove TikTok from the US app stores. What do you think the response from the Chinese government would be?
fine. I think they would leave. I think they would leave. And
Do you
honestly,
think
I
there's any
think
recourse on American industries? Would the Chinese retaliate in some form or fashion?
I don't think that they have much room to do so because they already have banned many top US tech companies from China. You cannot access Google without getting onto a VPN. You certainly can't access Facebook, Twitter, any form of social media originating from the US without a VPN in China. And there are several other like situations. And so there's not too many more people to expel from the country. Having said that, I think the ultimate recourse here is to rely on the strength of your product. I recognize that I say this with a little bit of bias as a startup person, but I do think that the strength of your product is what carries you at the end of the day. And TikTok is one of the very, very limited, actually, Chinese success stories in that there aren't too many businesses that originate from China and get true international pickup. It can be very popular among the Chinese diaspora or among people who do a lot of business with China. WeChat is a great example of that. But TikTok was truly international. had the reach of the absolute best US social media companies. And so if the product really is that good, people will find a way to access it. That's what we found here in technology, is that when you hit on product market fit, there is nothing stopping a user from getting access to that product. And so I think the Chinese are probably content to sit back on this one and say, all right, if you are going to disallow TikTok from operating in the US and being available on US servers, let's see what lengths your population will go to in order to access this product. And right now, TikTok in the US has 150 million daily active users. Half the population uses TikTok on a daily basis. That is incredible market power, and I think they're willing to put that to the test.
And well, speaking of companies to ban, they haven't banned Apple yet. I think that's their trump card. I don't know if that has any recourse on Chinese users if they actually ban Apple. But what is the attitude towards the Americans from the Chinese perspective? We talked about the American attitude towards Chinese tech, but what do you think is the Chinese attitude towards American companies? It seems to me on the surface, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that they are open to doing business with US companies. Just this week, for example, Elon Musk was in Beijing talking about the rollout of full self-driving cars, Tesla, in China. Do you think China overall is open to the idea of cooperating with US tech companies more, or are they more protectionist in their policies as well?
I would say China definitely has always had a very protectionist bent in its policies, even to this day, when a lot of these companies and industries have actually hit declining marginal returns on their growth, which means that they've reached maturity. With respect to companies like Apple and Tesla, I think those are circumstances in which the areas of technology are of great interest to China. Tesla is over there as a friend, and they have every interest in preserving the China market. I think Tim Cook is a masterful politician, actually, one of the most skilled diplomats we have in the United States. And what he's been able to do all these years is walk that fine line of being able to operate in China, so keeping much of the supply chain in China, which already sends a strong signal to the Chinese population that Apple is very pro-China. It continues to sell its products within China and to localize as necessary. But at the same time, I think that Tim Cook has thrown a bone to those in the United States who are interested in onshoring more jobs, for instance, for people who produce Apple devices. So it really is a delicate balance. And I think for China, you have these one-off, very feel-good instances in which there is appetite for cooperation. But I think overall, the attitude remains quite protectionist. I think for much of the Chinese population, what they have been conditioned to believe is that if there is an option between a Chinese product and a foreign product or an American product, they would give a chance to the Chinese product first. There are exceptions to that. Obviously, there are global brands that are still highly desired within China. But I think for the most part, over the last 10 years, certainly, you've seen attitude shift in the local population. It is no longer just about, look at us having all of this international access now. We want to travel. We want to see the world. We want to do business overseas. I think people are much more comfortable now staying home.
There's been some concern from pundits that it doesn't matter who wins the election in November, whether it be a Biden reelection or a Trump reelection, it would be a second term presidency for either party. And so there's concern that a second term president may become more hawkish towards foreign policy uh, with China, which is to say that they may, both sides may be a bit more belligerent in the way they deal with each other. Is that a concern for you?
I would say typically that has been true, that presidents, when they win a second term, they tend to be more hawkish because they are going to shoot their shot. No pun intended. They are going to do what they can to really implement their agenda because they know that they cannot run again. I would say that in both of these cases here, it's going to be a little bit different. I think all along, President Biden never had a doubt in his mind that he was going to run again. I know that there was a lot of talk about him stepping aside for other talent, but I think he always was resolved to see the project through. And um, to that end, he's going to make sure that the second administration is going to really pave the way for future American security, stability, prosperity, and that his successor, God willing, is also going to be a Democrat, and that he will have done a good job to pave the way for them. He always thinks about the long term and history at this point. For him, let's be real, and a lot of people have made this point. The short term does not mean terribly much. And if he had based all of his policy decisions and his efforts around what's going to happen in the short term and something that could benefit him personally, he would not have gone after an infrastructure bill. He would not have pushed so aggressively for legislation around climate change. And he would not, frankly, be this careful in terms of foreign policy conduct. Now, with respect to a Trump administration, this would be a second term, but it wouldn't be a continuous one. And the interesting thing, and sort of the $1 million question right now for many in the Republican Party is, let's say that he wins. What is the administration going to look like? Is he going to hire sort of quote unquote run of the mill Republicans? These would have been the General Mattises in the original administration, the John Kellys of the world. So people with experience but more conservative views. Or is it going to be Trump loyalists? Now, I can guarantee you, if it is just going to be Trump loyalists around him, then I do think that we are in for 4 years of significant instability. But it's we're talking now in April, David, and the election is really just about 6 months away, which is a little scary to think about, given all that needs to be done in the meantime. Um, but I do think you're looking at two very, very different administrations depending on the outcome.
All right, I'd like to learn a bit more about Saga. First of all, what is Saga? And then we'll talk a little bit about gaming as well.
Absolutely. So Saga is base infrastructure in Web3 / crypto. And the goal of Saga is to be the highest performance and lowest cost environment possible for a developer to build in. So for those of you who are a little more familiar with crypto, it's a layer one and it's a layer one to launch layer ones. So the easiest way to think of it is that it's basically cloud. It's basically cloud for blockchains. Anytime that you need to build on chain, you can spin up your own dedicated instance, your own dedicated server, and off you go to build your application, to host it there, and start to interact with the chain. The way that we have built the system, it is meant to infinitely scale. And we have also architected the underlying bare metal or the infrastructure to make sure that the costs are close to commodity pricing as possible. So we've really tried to democratize the developer experience as much as we can in Web3. Now, with that kind of infinitely scaling system, who needs it the most? It really is gaming and entertainment. So gaming and entertainment is currently what we're focused on, even though it is a general purpose infrastructure platform. Those are the majority of the applications that are building on here.
Okay, so let's talk about video games. One of my favorite topics. I
Yeah.
grew up playing video games. I grew up on N64, PlayStation 2, all the way to
Wow.
4, and then I haven't played the latest one. I grew up on console games, PC games.
Yeah.
I've played pretty much all the hottest hits over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I do not, from please educate me and many
Yeah.
others in my age group. I do not understand why games need to be on Web3 for them to be fun because I didn't grow up in that environment. So that's my question. Why do we need Web3 games?
So there's nothing wrong with traditional gaming. And I think that that can be said by a Call of Duty fan about an old Atari game.
Sure,
It can be said about a Counter-Strike fan throughout all the decades that that game has been popular.
sure.
So games that are great are just going to be timeless because they're fun. Provided that you still have the technology around to support it, I think that people will just keep going back to it. And it's also a memory of your childhood as well. So games that are fun have staying power. Now, what does Web3 add to all of that? I would say that it's not so much that we make the game loop itself more fun in most cases. I mean, some developers are quite ingenious about leveraging the technology, but it's in this, it's in the community and collective experience. So the two fastest growing games in the last 5, 8 years or so are Roblox and Fortnite. And for much of the younger generation, gaming is first and foremost a social experience. Yes, the game loop itself has to be fun. And the art production and the look and feel of the game, all of that has to be polished and a great user experience. But first and foremost, you are there to hang with your friends. And so for Fortnite, the reason why it's so popular is that you have proliferation of all these worlds through customized skins and avatars. And then with respect to Roblox, I mean, Robux is basically cash for kids. Um, this is what they use to be able to transact within the game. And there's also a great deal of customization around identities there as well. And so you have UGC really dominating game growth, user generated content. The problem with how traditional gaming can operate is that there is a limit to which UGC can grow when it is centrally controlled. And the thing about Web3 is, as much as it is a technology phenomenon, it is first and foremost a social phenomenon. It is about decentralized control of something. And in this case, it is the decentralized generation of content and intellectual property. So if you have worked hard for an in-game asset, if you are so engaged with a game and are so plugged into that community and social experience that you have customized skins and avatars to become an extension of yourself within that game, you want to own that. You want to have control of that. And that is where crypto and Web3 both have a lot to contribute.
Well, I'm a big World of Warcraft fan.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into my World of Warcraft history, but it was a lot of hours played. I could see what you're talking about
Yeah.
being applied to a massive online RPG where you have hundreds of thousands of users collectively playing the same game, but customizing their own world, like we do in our world, right? It's not a
Yeah.
centralized company creating the skins or the equipment for you. We're creating our own functions, our own tools, equipment, so on and so forth. Is that where the industry is headed?
I think so. I think so because, especially from the perspective of gaming in general, so this is the wider gaming industry. I think The Economist did an issue a year ago that was all about gaming and how gaming was really eating media, in that a lot of the different media forms, whether it was film, TV, they were starting to get into gaming, to be gaming adjacent, to take games and generate content out of that. But why? Why is all of this happening? I do think that World of Warcraft is a great example of this. Minecraft is also another classic example where the gamers and game developers are looking to take what someone else has built, and everyone acknowledges that it's been built by an original creator, and to really make it their own. So I do think that this is where things are headed. People really want to partake in entertainment. So not just consume it, but to create it themselves. And to loop back to an earlier topic that we covered today, TikTok, what is the phenomenon behind TikTok, given that it is late to the party as a social media platform? So when it came onto the scene, obviously the big dogs, so Meta, Twitter, they were already dominating. Insta through Facebook, they were also dominating. So what gives about TikTok in particular? YouTube was also there for video sharing content. It was a place where you could be weird and normal, yet celebrated. And that is a community building exercise. And I think more and more with respect to millennials for sure, but definitely Gen Z, Alpha, anyone younger than that, they feel that it is their birthright to be able to express themselves in their digital lives. And so it really is this exercise of self expression, creation, being a part of this make believe world, which gaming is all about. So, yes, I do think that gaming is going in this direction, but entertainment is going in this direction as well. And a lot of people are going to insist more and more upon ownership of the things that they create.
So I understand the overall idea and the thesis behind this, but why aren't the big game studios making inroads into blockchain and Web3 gaming? We're seeing this from the independent studios, right?
Yeah.
Saga and all their partners from Saga with Saga rather. But
Mhm.
why isn't Activision or Rockstar pursuing blockchain gaming?
This really agitates against their business model. In theory, it should not, but it does. And it's for the same reason that, say, the Marvel comic universe has such a hard time incorporating fandom into its canon, or DC Comics, no shortage of fan fiction, fan art, fan merchandising that has come out of DC Comics intellectual property. But when Warner Brothers or when Disney looks at the wealth of monetization opportunities out there, typically what the studio bosses have to contend with is, on the one hand, we have put in so much investment, and it's true that they have, into making this content. It is great IP, and it's not easy to make great IP and content that will last for a long time, let alone support a full franchise. And so we want to realize as much of the revenue potential here, and that means control. We want to control this as much as possible. On the other hand, they understand that there's a great deal of monetization happening among the fans who are producing this content, among the users. But how exactly do they capture that? There actually are no easy technology rails by which they can capture that. And so many years have gone by, many decades have gone by, arguably, and just nothing has been done to capture that content and the revenue opportunity from it. So it's not within the nature of a big studio to pursue this kind of revenue opportunity. Now, are they going to get there someday? I think they will, but it's sort of what happened with Netflix and streaming. Netflix had to win first. Hulu had to win first, and then the big studios would come on board. It is partially a matter of them changing their thinking and changing their business structures, but it's also about risk management. Is there something actually here? And when a startup makes money doing this and is starting to, I hate this word, but it's probably appropriate here, to cannibalize the profits and the money-making ability of these larger studios, that's when people will pay attention. And then likely there will probably be overinvestment in catching up with the technology. But that is how these industries ultimately change.
But okay, so where does the crypto component come in?
Hmm.
I'm playing a game. Let's say it's decentralized. I get to control various aspects myself. But why do I need a crypto to change? I could, in theory, transact peer to peer using fiat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it really depends on the design of that particular game or that platform. You don't have to have crypto, you don't have to have a token in order to make this work. You do need something recorded on chain. And at the very least, I think that it's going to be game state, which means that it's going to be your actions in the game. So your record, your number of kills, the in-game assets that you have really grinded to be able to earn, these are all going to be recorded on chain. And then you can take that, because it has monetary value. You can take that elsewhere, transact upon it, or you can just transfer it to other ecosystems. Maybe there are other instances or servers of the game that you want to participate in. You can transfer your assets there as well. So you can do this completely free of any tokens or NFTs, that's for sure. But there needs to be some sort of chain component in order to make sure that you tap into a decentralized system where you're able to assert your ownership.
And how do investors take part in this ecosystem? Many of these startups are private,
Mhm.
and so we're wondering what we can do to be exposed to the sector.
Yeah, so I would say this. Every token that has any sort of wide distribution has the kind of utility that I'm talking about. So there is some way in which you use the token in order to get access to the system. And that is probably the best way in which consumers can get exposed to crypto. Having said that, I think there is a huge movement within Web3, and I think this is absolutely necessary to hit the next phase of growth, where we hide the blockchain elements. So you are still interacting with crypto, you're still interacting with the chain, but you as a user are actually not aware of it. And so right now we're talking about things like tokens and NFTs, but in the future, we may be talking about things like the equivalent of Robux, for instance, or just custom skins and avatars. They live on chain, and they do give you that experience of having decentralized ownership, but you wouldn't need to know anything about crypto in order to participate in the system. So right now, the entry point for all of this is something around the utility token, so the token that you actually use to access the system, the applications that are built on top of these chains. But I think in the very, very near future, the blockchain will be unrecognizable, unnoticeable to the everyday consumer.
I see. All right, well, tell us what's next for Saga.
Well, we launched about 3 weeks ago, so it's been incredibly busy. But thank you. But our product is now live. In crypto, we call it mainnet. So that means that your main network is now live. And so we have been shepherding that process, making sure that all the developers who are building on here, that they can successfully get their applications to market. That is going to be our main focus this year. But David, I got to tell you, crypto oftentimes, because as you can see, even when the market is choppy, it's doing pretty well for itself. I think at Saga, we take the attitude that that's not enough. The reason why we all got into this industry is to really have an impact on the world and to really achieve that wider cultural resonance and be able to tap into the zeitgeist. And so, in order to do that, I do think we need to be competitive with what is currently offered by traditional industry. In our case, for this year in particular, it's going to be focused on gaming. The number of users that games and gaming platforms are expected to have, if they are to be healthy in the gaming industry, we would like to achieve that at Saga. And honestly, with Saga Origins, which is a publishing house that we debuted at GDC this year, we are seeking to promote those games, publish those games, back those games that are provocative, expansive, uncompromising. In all honesty, many of these games, because of the nature of the content, or maybe because of the developer being a little too indie, they are rejected by the big studios. And that's the nature of the content machine. Is once you mature, your decisions about what gets published, what gets produced, they're going to start to be constrained. But Web3 is all about pushing the envelope and really promoting the creative freedom that being in a decentralized system affords you. So some of the titles that we have coming out this year really embody that spirit. And I think it's not just a conversation that's going to happen in crypto any longer. It's going to spill out to people who are gamers, who are interested in gaming, but I think people who are interested in just what's happening in the wider culture. What are the trends? What's moving people? What's going to shape our society? Saga aims to be at the forefront of that conversation.
Final question. What is your personal favorite video game?
Oh my goodness. I mean, probably no surprise to anyone who knows me, Call of Duty. Classic.
Really? Okay.
Call
All
of
right.
Duty.
Which one?
Ah, God. It's hard to pick because the older versions are the ones that I've obviously spent more time with, and therefore I'm just better at them. But I don't know, like people really knock the latest one, and I just, for me, games are moving films. And so the more photorealistic they become, the more realistic the action becomes, the more I like it. So yeah, I mean, I haven't been able to spend too much time on the latest one, but I do like it.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's follow your journey and your saga with Saga, so to speak, and we'll stay in touch. Tell us where we can follow your work.
Absolutely. David, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. You can always follow me on Twitter. My handle is just at Becca Liao. And you can follow Saga at Saga XYZ. Is a double underscore after that. There's also our website, which is probably easier to remember, saga.xyz. And there's also my personal website, just RebeccaLiao.com. But my channels of communication are always open. I love hearing from people. And if you're ever curious about any of the topics that we talked about today, I'm always game for a great chat. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Well, don't forget to follow Rebecca in the links down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.